I don't think, or I don't know if they call them the dancers, the dancing Israelis, but that was never actually in the media. I think they use the word celebrating when describing those Israelis. So
Yeah.
I say the celebrating Israelis, but whether or not they had something to do with the supposed controlled demolition of the towers, I don't know. You
Yeah,
know,
that's the thing with a lot of this stuff is it becomes like a dogmatic pissing contest kind of thing within the movement, like a lot of these other things have, where it's like, if you don't say that Israel's behind 9/11, you're not like hardcore enough. I mean, it's like this weird mentality that I see all the time. But I mean, I just think again, it's just you can't make declarations like that because I mean, it does seem like there is some connection to some aspect of maybe Israeli intelligence to some stuff involving 9/11. I mean, just the
well,
fact that there was these art students living in close proximity to some of the 9/11 hijackers in Florida leading up to 9/11 in multiple instances, different groups of hijackers living near different groups of Israeli art students. It
well,
raises a ton of questions, but I just think that these declarative, we know what happened on 9/11, we think we know that the Mossad did 9/11 or whatever, it's just not useful to actually like digging up the truth about 9/11.
with all of the Zionists that were in the Bush administration, Israel didn't even need to be involved. You know what I mean? Like there were so many Zionists in the Bush administration. Um,
Well, that's another aspect to you mentioned Palestinians earlier, John. I mean, there is a strange, one of the first pieces of original research I did on 9/11 was analyzing the thread of anti-Palestinian propaganda that was being distributed on mainstream media the day of 9/11. The most famous example being the dancing Palestinians, so
right.
celebrating the 9/11 attacks on the streets that was aired around 11 a.m. But it's very fascinating to look back at, and I'm inspired by Paul Thompson, obviously, with laying out timelines, but like the timeline of how many inserts there were on the media. First, right when the Pentagon gets hit, we have a news report coming in saying that the DFLP, a Palestinian group, was claiming responsibility for 9/11, and then right before the Shanksville, Pennsylvania crash, there's media reports that the next plane is on its way to Camp David because of the similarity between the date of 9/11 and when the Palestinian Camp David Accords were signed, implying again that this had some kind of Palestinian backing behind it. So those things I think are interesting and imply that someone who wanted to blame this on Palestinians was pulling strings and getting things into the media. Again, that doesn't connect Israel to it, but it is a strange thing that I think it's hard to deny that there was some kind of manufactured, seeded narrative coming in, and then at some point it switches to Bin Laden. But if you look at all the stuff for earliest in the day of 9/11, it's all about Palestinians, and I think someone was trying to put that out there very deliberately. But who was it? Who was doing it? I can't say. But there are government officials who are being credited on these CNN reports saying like, we have an anonymous FBI report that there's might be Palestinian involvement in this and such and such. So um, there were people in the government seemingly seeded this out there, but whether it came from the Zionists in the Bush administration or not, I honestly couldn't say.
Yeah, it is really striking. The last year that was the 20th anniversary on 9/11, I watched some of the old, just raw footage coverage of the day, and it's very striking how much Palestine comes up in those early hours. It's basically the narrative is there's not a whole lot of speculating going on from the commentators at the time because they're just in shock, but the scrolls at the bottom are just like raw reports that they're passing along. It's very Palestine focused.
For sure. And this can all be verified with a series of leaks that WikiLeaks got access to. And I don't know if it's public data. I mean, it looks like it is on some level, but they had a pager system that was
Right.
that has a very laid out timeline, like to the second. And you can get these pages and pages of these 9/11 pager data leaks that include wire reports from AP and Reuters, like the second they come in. So it's like a really useful tool to just to see what the media narrative was and how it's being shaped like in real time. Because of course, all those wire reports get fed into like the TV, 24-hour networks, and they just repeat those. And those are probably partly what you're seeing on the little Chiron, moving at the bottom, or just these like AP, dash DFLP claims responsibility for, and it's just sort of interesting that it's like that first report comes in like literally this, within seconds of the plane hitting the Pentagon. Just sort of odd timing when you look at the timeline of it all. So I don't know what that means, but it's just creepy to go back and just look at those leaks, because that's what I gleaned from those leaks. So that was that was my first piece of like original research, that I could contribute to the movement, I guess. And that happened like probably like 10 years after I started looking at this stuff. So so I feel like a lot of my time spent in this movement was probably somewhat indulgent, but I also was, learning myself, like what I actually felt comfortable enough putting out there, because, you don't at a certain point, I didn't want to put out stuff that was disinfo, because so much of the stuff I had taken in over the years was disinfo. So a lot of that was learning how to like filter that out of my system, just looking back on all that stuff I'd taken in.
Yeah. Well, and one of your big focuses, which is somewhat tangential, but maybe it is related to 9/11, is the anthrax attacks. And why do you think part of it's obvious. There was a much, much smaller death toll. It wasn't as spectacular an event on TV. But why do you think that seeped out of the consciousness in such a pretty much completely? To the extent that, there are people out there who kind of barely remember that it happened.
Bush kept us safe after 9/11.
Right,
Oh,
right.
but what about the anthrax attack?
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Just based on the, the 9/11 20th anniversary, I just sort of inspired me to go back and look at the anthrax attacks again, look at a list that I had already been making over the years of people who seem to be close to either the anthrax or 9/11. Well, let's put it this way. There's a group of suspects. Kevin Ryan writes this book. Some of it's very sort of out on a limb. He makes quite a few leaps, but he compiles a list of names, 19 names. The book is called Another 19, of people he believes may be connected to the 9/11 attacks, who are like Americans, almost all American names, who are people in corporate industries and various aspects of government. So using that as inspiration, it's sort of like, well, what about people who might have been involved in the anthrax attacks? And this was like rudimentary early on. I could probably make a much bigger list now, Gumby. I'm sure all these people at Fort Detrick. They weren't familiar to me at the time, but like it was more people like Rudy Giuliani, people who I thought were oddly close to the anthrax attacks. And then I started looking at people's who were from both lists, adding to Kevin Ryan's list, making my own about anthrax, that there seemed to be actual overlap between both lists. Like people who were appearing on both lists, I thought, well, maybe if I just look at those people who have seeming connections to both 9/11 cover-up or the attacks, the anthrax attacks or the cover-up together, where will that lead me? So the map itself sort of came out of that. And it originally started as just, inputting all of the addresses of all the people who were players or victims in the anthrax attacks, the 9/11 hijackers' addresses, the Israeli art student addresses, for example, just because that was something that I already had easy access to, and just mapping all this stuff out just in Florida specifically. It just led me into some really interesting and bizarre directions. For example, Paul Manafort, a character that I largely ignored during the whole Russiagate saga. I didn't think he was someone really important to look at all. It turns out that he's part of a company called Manafort Brothers Construction that has all these odd proximity connections to aspects of the 9/11 attacks. Let's just say their company does. Paul Manafort himself lives oddly close to people involved in urban moving systems, a moving company that was involved in that Dancing Israelis episode that we were talking about earlier. So it led me into some strange directions like that. And I think that, that also I owe a lot of inspiration to Daniel Hopsicker's research, who seemed to focus in his research almost entirely on the Florida 9/11 connections. And he also spends a lot of time looking at the flight schools in which some of these 9/11 hijackers were going to for lessons, or even one of the flight schools in particular actually hooked them up with an apartment because one of the guys involved in the flight schools also knew people who managed apartments in the area. In fact, a lot of the students lived in apartments around this particular flight school. And Daniel Hopzicker's work really shows that I think that some of these flight schools have very odd connections to, uh, potential intelligence connections, let's say, and like lots of several of them actually have involvement with like drug trafficking and were facing convictions. And one of them, Rudy Deckers in particular, is very suspicious. And I think that it's just really interesting when you look at all the geography specifically in Florida. But then when you add in the anthrax attacks into the mix, which I mean, I was probably the first person to, overlay that information over, Daniel Hopzicker's research. It just, I mean, there's just so many different connections it's led me into that it's hard to know which one to pick. But I mean, if you had like something specific, I'm just probably forgetting. I mean, Rudy Giuliani, for example, his wife lives like door to door, kitty like right across the door from in a condominium complex from one of the 9/11 hijackers. So that was just something fascinating that I found. I don't know what that means, but that's like, wow, that's so weird that I've never heard seen someone pull that out before. So this is mostly just from public records lookup. So it's not like I'm out there on the ground like interviewing people in Florida, but yeah, so I recommend people check that out. And it's called the Florida 2001 Attacks Event Map. And it has categories like Giuliani, his business associates. It has categories like George W. Bush's activities on the day of 9/11, and Jeb Bush's like addresses and his different important addresses that were related to him throughout Florida. And there's also weird things like Jeb Bush lives really close to one of the 9/11 hijackers, or he has a property very close by to one of them. So,
Yeah.
and I'm hoping that the map might eventually lead other researchers in directions that they might not have thought of before.
Yeah, I'd like to read something from an article by Gail Sheehy, who was a reporter that covered the 9/11 or the Jersey Girls when they were doing their thing. And this is from August 24th, 2003. And the families had met with the FBI. And it says, after the formal meeting, senior agents in the room faced a grilling by Kristen Brautweiser, a 9/11 widow whose cohorts are three other widowed moms from New Jersey. Quote, I don't understand. With all the warnings about the possibilities of Al Qaeda using planes as weapons and the Phoenix memo from one of your own agents warning that Osama bin Laden was sending operatives to this country for flight school training, why didn't you check out flight schools before 9/11? And the agent responds, quote, do you know how many flight schools there are in the U.S.? Thousands, a senior agent protested. We couldn't have investigated them all and found these few guys. And Kristen responds, quote, wait, you just told me there were too many flight schools and that prohibited you from investigating them before 9/11. How is it that a few hours after the attacks, the nation is brought to its knees and miraculously FBI agents showed up at Embry-Riddle Flight School in Florida where some of the terrorists trained? And the FBI agent responded, we got lucky. Um, and then Kristen then asked the agent how the FBI had known exactly which ATM in Portland, Maine would yield the videotape of Muhammad Atta, the leader of the attacks. And the agent got some facts confused and changed the story. When Kristen wouldn't be pacified by evasive answers, the senior agent parried, what are you getting at? And she said, I think you had open investigations before September 11th on some of the people responsible for the terrorist attacks. And the agent unequivocally said, we did not. But I always love that we got lucky quote as far as them being able to go directly to the flight schools that these people trained at. You know,
Apparently, Jeb Bush accompanied one of the. There was like they whisked away a bunch of materials really quickly from the one that Rudy Decker.
yeah, Daniel Hopsiker was dead on with Rudy Deckers. There was a report in the last 10 years or so where Rudy Deckers was found to still be drug trafficking, I think.
Hmm.
Um, so that kind of validated what Hopsiker was writing about.
Yeah, and even one of the guys who trained one of the hijackers for doing martial arts training for a period of time, he used to be like a DEA special forces guy, like in the 90s, and he has all these DA awards and stuff, and it's just odd how many of these people, these hijackers, came into contact with people like that. You know, not even mentioning like foreign intelligence officials who are shadowing them, but like just this guy who was a DA special forces guy is apparently giving what's this, I don't even remember the hijacker's name, but he's one of the hijackers who apparently helped storm the cockpit door, and he taught him some of his moves. So it's just a lot of odd connections like that. I don't even know if Hopsiker wrote about that guy specifically, but he's out there on the map as well.
I think this is a good place to wrap up. I think this was great. Learned a lot. I think it was just what we wanted to get at. So
I mean, I'll just say that I hope that I do notice there's like sort of a uptick in people coming from the world of just regular anti-imperialism, who are getting more open to exploring 9/11 truth as a topic. I think there's younger people too who are not burdened by all of the debunker, hate campaigns, smear campaigns against 9/11 trutherism, that are also curious about it. So I'm hopeful that I see more people like that. And I don't want to also discount people who are more conspiratorial minded and people who are just generally drift towards conspiracies as well. I mean, but I do tend to worry that a lot of that stuff is getting mixed together with like QAnon or satanic panic or
Hmm.
stuff that is, basically Alex Jones or in some cases worse now. And it's actually kind of fascinating because you'll see people like Rudy Giuliani, for example, dipping into, uh, acting like he's against the deep state and signaling all these things like he's a kind of a conspiracy pilled guy now. And it's like, wait a second, you're, a potential suspect here. What are you doing? So I don't know. I mean, even seeing like pictures of like Sean Stone, Oliver Stone's son, smoking cigars with Rudy Giuliani is just, it's just insane to me. But um, I still do have hope that I see more people who are studying deep state stuff, JFK, for example, Oklahoma City bombing. I see more people like going back into the weeds on that stuff in a way that is not, um, let's just say, not sensationalist, not clickbaity. They're genuinely interested in digging up information about it. And I'm hoping that there's a revival eventually with like 9/11, like a whole new generation of people who research things from, genuine curiosity, who are not like just trying to have a pissing contest with each other about who thinks the building was blown up the craziest. I mean, because at a certain point, it's like even the Stephen Jones thing you brought up earlier. Yeah, it's like we don't know, even if you're a believer that the buildings were demolished by controlled demolition, like just to lean on this idea that it must have been thermite or one specific thing that one researcher has put out there. I just think it's just ultimately a losing game. I mean, so like hopefully people do not make the same mistakes again. But I think that I think we're sort of on the cusp of maybe a revival of um, a kind of a version of the 9/11 truth movement, but maybe hopefully one that's like more responsible
I
and
do.
high
Go ahead.
quality. That's all. That's all I had to say.
I do see new people coming out asking questions about the 9/11 attacks. People who were babies at the time of 9/11 who are now questioning, what happened that day. And I'm hoping to, if I'm still around doing this shit, to give them some form of guidance. And the only guidance that I could say right now is just support the families who are fighting for truth, accountability, and justice. If you see news concerning the lawsuits, post it. Post it once, post it twice, post it 3 times. That I seem sometimes be the only one to ever post that shit, it seems. And I would love to see other people start spreading the word about what they're doing. but you should always support the 9/11 families, as far as I'm concerned. And keep it simple. Don't get uh, too involved in theories. And theories are human nature. When you have people in government who should be able to answer your questions but refuse to do so, it's human nature to theorize as to the reasons why. But theories aren't fact, and they shouldn't be presented as such. Try to be responsible, you know, and understand that the importance of this subject. Because again, the policies of our government over the last 20 years has led to where we are today with the Ukraine. And so it should be looked at. And a lot of people refer to 9/11 as the new Pearl Harbor. And I honestly believe that people should start addressing it as America's Reichstag fire. And that this has kind of been part of the plan all along, I think.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that 9/11 bought the U.S. empire a hell of a lot of time on the world stage. And that's all I think. That's why it seems so evil and cynical. It's like on some level, this U.S. empire situation can't last forever. So I guess this just borrowed it some more time.
Yep, absolutely. But I want to thank both of you guys for having us on to talk about this. I hope it gets a lot of listens.
Well,
Keith, really appreciate you having us on.
yeah, thanks to you guys, and thanks to Dave for having me be a part of this. This was a great conversation. Feel like we covered, so much ground, and I came to this subject a lot later than Jon and Robbie, much later, and came to it in a lot of ways through Jon and Robbie's work. So I really admire the work that you guys have done. And I see sometimes like Robbie or like I know Abby said this, where they're like a little embarrassed that like they had the Alex Jones phase. But for me, and I don't see people talk about this a lot, I feel embarrassed that I had the official narrative phase for like 10, 15 years after the event, because I didn't really question it that much. I watched Loose Change or whatever and kind of dismissed it. And, truthers were just kind of like, yeah, people who got in your face and were kind of annoying. And, that was just my very superficial perception of it. So I think it's worth mentioning, it's worth noting that like, as much as people get shit on for being on one side of it, people never get shit on for being basically wrong about it in the other direction for so long. So, again, you guys have been doing, some of the best work out there. Jon's interviews, the We Were Lied to About 9/11 interviews, which he compiled into the book, which Dave has on his site and is all searchable, which is another great resource.
Nice.
That's some of the best stuff. And also in the families, one
Thank
thing I
you.
did want to mention is Ray McGinnis has that new book out that is tied very closely to the families,
Yep.
unanswered questions. And I think that's a good, recent resource for people to kind of look into.
Every day he posts another question from the 9/11 Family Steering Committee, and I feel like I'm taking a test.
Yeah.
What's the answer to that? Oh, let's see. And I try to post as much corroborating information as I can for the question, because we've been doing this a long time. But yeah, definitely check out Ray McGinnis's book, Unanswered Questions. It kind of vindicates me as far as maintaining our focus on the families and such, what I've been saying all these years. Because if you just look at the questions, it just boggles your mind.
Yeah, every day you post a question, and every day basically it's the 9/11 Commission, didn't do anything with this. Nobody ever responded, so that's the name of the book, Unanswered Questions.
I'd also like to promote the 9/11 Family Steering Committee's website, which is absolutely probably the most important website about 9/11 out there. It's the 911independentcommission.org. And it houses their unanswered questions. It houses their testimony before the 9/11 Commission, and it shows all of the different press releases that they had at the time where they had all these different problems with the 9/11 Commission. It shows you the history. They made statements about government minders, which were people who accompanied witnesses and intimidated witnesses and answered questions for witnesses, or gave them the idea that they would tell their boss about the different things that they said, to try and intimidate the witnesses. And that's just one thing that they focused on. Or calling for Bush and Cheney to be under oath, that's in there. I mean, calling for Philip Zelikow resignation, they did it twice. I always thought they did it once, but when you read through the site, you see they did it 2 times. So there's so much stuff in there.
No, it's great to have all these resources, and hopefully this will be a resource for people to listen to and learn from, because I definitely learned a lot. So thank you, all three of you, and yeah, I really appreciate it.
This is Our Hidden History